Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the OTT.X Wednesday webinar series. On behalf of all of us at OTT.X, I want to once again thank you for joining us today. This is a series where we are, as always, delighted to bring you insightful, thought-provoking presentations across a broad spectrum of OTT-related topics from thought leaders across our industry. The TV market today is undergoing seismic and lasting changes, with broadcast, cable, and streaming television all set on a collision course. Untapped revenue opportunities abound for today's ad-supported streaming platforms as media buyers and advertisers begin shifting spend from traditional TV to CTV and streaming. How can AVOD and FAST services best take advantage of these opportunities to win greater share of TV ad dollars while delivering exceptional viewer ad experiences? To help us answer this question and more, I'm pleased to introduce Beachfront's VP of Product, Amit Nigam. Amit is a seasoned product and partnership executive with a demonstrated history of working in the media marketing and advertising industry. Currently, Nigam serves as the Vice President of Product at Beachfront Media, where he leads the sell-side ad server's product management team and drives the vision, strategy, and execution of the company's key roadmap initiatives. Prior to joining Beachfront, Nigam served in executive product positions at ad tech companies Perion and iView. He also held key media buying and strategy roles at OMD, Horizon Media, and Maxis. He's worked closely with leading brands, including PepsiCo, Kraft, and Arm & Hammer. With that, I'll turn it over to Amit to get things kicked off.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for the introduction, Eric. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to talking to you guys today about a couple of really exciting things that we're seeing in the industry, in the CTV landscape. So as Eric mentioned, I'm the head of product at Beachfront. We are a sell-side ad server that helps our publisher and distributor partners with workflow automation and maximizing yield and monetization with a specific focus in convergence. And I think especially some of the content that we're going to be covering today, I think it really ties really nicely to a lot of the things that we're focused on as a business and why we're so excited about where we sit and what's happening in the ecosystem. So without further ado, I'll share my screen here and talk through what we've prepared for you today. So as Eric mentioned, the focus of our conversation today is going to be around capitalizing on convergence, and specifically what we're seeing in two pieces of the converged landscape around AVOD and FAST services. And what we plan to do is talk you through what we're seeing, and then also give you guys some strategies on how we think you can best capitalize on these pieces and maximize what you're able to drive in terms of profitability. So just a quick overview on agenda. So we'll start with just an overview of the convergent TV ad market and give you some numbers and some facts that we're seeing that get us excited about this space. Then we'll talk a bit about the latest advancements in sell-side CTV ad tech. And then finally, we'll finish off with what we see as some of the best practices to maximize monetization and to maximize yield within that space. So first, let's just start with some numbers and some information on convergence. I think this probably doesn't come as a surprise, but we are seeing more and more viewers flocking to CTV. More and more people are moving in that space. And I think we'll continue to see that grow and rise. But what we see on our side is that traditional TV is still where the lion's share of the consumption occurs. So, as a high-level stat, we recently saw CTV overtake cable, which was previously the largest driver of viewership. But we still see that the combination of cable and broadcast drives the lion's share of where the eyes are spending the time viewing on TV, right? So traditional TV still has its role to play, more than its role to play in CTV, at least for today. And I think, we've seen that trend kind of level out, and it'll continue on this path for the foreseeable future. But what we also see is in every case, that eyeballs, dollars follow eyeballs, so to speak, right? So as we see that growth in CTV, we also see the money that's moving into that space grow, and we expect that to continue to increase over the next 3 years. And there's no reason to expect that to stop. I think as we see more and more people moving into CTV for their viewership behavior, that's a logical place for brands to invest their money to be effective in terms of their communication. And I think, from our perspective, there's a number of reasons why we see this as must buy, right? I think, first of all, CTV itself continues to grow. And I think where we see the money moving in, we expect CTV investments to be moving out of linear. And we see, convergence in the marketplace itself for buying over the coming years, specifically in FAST, right? And, AVOD and FAST kind of combined here, but definitely in the FAST space, this is a projection of what we're going to see in growth in FAST over time. And I think a lot of this, and we'll talk more about this as we go through this discussion, has to do with viewership expectation as we move into streaming and what viewers are expecting in terms of their experience, right? And I think where we see FAST growth, or where we project it, has a lot to do with the way that FAST itself behaves from a user perspective. You're, in a traditional environment where you have a channel guide and you're moving through content within that. And that mirrors a lot of what we see in linear and what that expectation has become. Obviously, AVOD also plays its role in terms of library-based viewing. And so we see growth in that, but it's what we've come to expect as viewers. And so we see that as a continuing trend over time in the expectation from a user perspective. With that being said, there still remain challenges in both AVOD and FAST. And I think a lot of what we're going to focus on in the second part of this presentation is how we address some of those challenges. So the first of this is lack of transparency. And I think a lot of what that has to do with is this concept that while you get better visibility in terms of who you're targeting and the addressability of the user, a lot of times brands feel like they're losing some of the information that they traditionally got around the content itself, right? So when brands bought content historically, or have bought content historically in a linear buying mechanism, they get a lot of visibility into what the content is. And a lot of that goes into brand alignment, to making sure that the brands are airing in content that they feel supports their brand initiatives. And just general information about where you're running from a brand safety perspective is really key. And we see this in a quote, right? So the thing is, when I buy linear TV, I know exactly where the ad ran. I just don't know who saw it. And when I buy CTV, it's just the opposite. I know exactly who saw the ad. I just don't know where it ran. And this really is sort of the fundamental problem of convergence as we deal with it in our time right now, as we see linear and CTV starting to sort of cross and trying to create an ecosystem where you're creating parity across those things. This is going to be the challenge that we need to solve as an industry for our time. Secondarily, I think a lot of the challenges have to do with fragmentation of buying. On the one hand, what is simple in terms of buying, from a programmatic perspective, there's challenges in how we execute that on FAST or on AVOD. It's not all one uniform way to go in and execute that buy. And so the more we can simplify that, the more we make it easy for money to move into this space. And a lot of what we're focused on, certainly at Beachfront, but I think across the industry as a whole, is simplifying that buying path. And then the third thing is misperceptions around quality. I think a lot of times what sort of gets attached to things that are in CTV or in the streaming space is sort of this concept of remnants, and we'll address that. I don't think that that's really a fair definition of what is actually in there from the content perspective. And I think there's a lot of tools that publishers can be using across all of their content to sort of maximize how they make money and how they make that available. And then last but not least, I think, certainly there's issues with measurement and frequency. And this isn't just an issue from a perspective of a brand where they're trying to maximize efficiency. I think it's also a huge user challenge, right? And I think we've all had experiences in our day-to-day viewing or video consumption where you see the same ad multiple times, you see the same ad multiple times in a row, or too many times within one program. And I think not only is that a challenge from getting people to stay tuned in and stay engaged with your platform, but it's also a major challenge for brands, right? Brands do not want to create a negative perception of their product by having overexposure. And so we need to also think consistently about how we're working through frequency of exposure to better both the user experience and the brand experience as they look to spend within these platforms. So those are kind of high level challenges that we see within FAST. And again, none of this takes away from our excitement within the space. It's just what we know we need to focus on to be successful moving forward. So we'll talk a little bit about advancements in sell-side CTV ad tech. And I think hopefully this will address some of the challenges that we see. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in terms of advancements from the IAB are going to help create consistency in those experiences, both from a user perspective and from a platform perspective. But I think the key thing that we want to start with is RTB 2.6. And really, just to give you guys kind of a high level background on this, it's a protocol or a communication that enables publishers to communicate effectively what inventory they're making available to buyers, right? And so anytime we're talking about RTB protocols, we're talking about real-time bidding protocols. It is what we're communicating from the pub side down to the buy side so that they can make informed decisions about what they're buying. And we're really excited about some of the advancements in 2.6. I think a lot of what we've needed to do as an industry to be successful in the proliferation of FAST has to do with, interestingly enough, making it work similar to the way that linear TV has always behaved. If you think about what brands have gotten out of linear TV over time, it is absolutely consistency in what you can expect from a competitive separation perspective. It is consistency of what the user experience is going to be, understanding of that content. And so a lot of what OpenRTB 2.6 is looking to address is some of those challenges, which is, sort of before this been a bit of a blind spot for the buyers. So this creates a common language between buyers to bid and bid confidently. And it's a protocol that allows us to do these things consistently with everything that we send downstream. It was released in April of 2022, so it's pretty recent. If you're not there yet on 2.6, don't worry. There's plenty of time to get there. And I think the two things that we'll focus on specifically in this conversation really have to do with the ad pod mechanism within OpenRTB. So starting to deal with ad delivery or ad monetization as a pod, right? Rather than thinking about it as individual slots, which is a huge evolution for our space and an incredibly exciting one. And then the other piece that we'll deal with that I mentioned is the content metadata. And really all that is sort of a fancy way of saying, what is the content that you would be bidding on as a buyer? What is it? Is it around the show itself, the genre? So creating standards around those things and creating visibility around that. And content metadata isn't a new thing in RTB, but we've added some things in network, et cetera, that are going to be strengthening that signal even further, right? And that's really our goal. Why does it matter? I think, 85 to 90% of what's transacted in CTV is transacted programmatically. Let me be crystal clear. That isn't always going to be in an open exchange environment. It can be programmatic guaranteed or through, private marketplace, and we'll get into that. But it is all happening through this mechanism because it simplifies the workflow for buying. And then I think the other thing that we talk about consistently is standardization. The more standard we can make these things, the more likely it is that you can get buyers leaned into buying it. They know what to expect. They can build algorithms off of that and see what's working and what's not. So the more we can standardize these things, the more we think the money will move in. And again, this ties to revenue upside for both FAST and AVOD. So at the end of the day, it is about creating positive user experiences. It is about creating transparency for the buy side, but we also want to maximize yield and monetization for our partners. And we really feel like RTB 2.6 gives us sort of the best chance to do that. So moving forward, just a couple of things around ad pods and specifically around programmatic enhancement. So there's a couple of things that I want to talk a bit about when it comes to what's sort of new in how we handle ad pods. Again, I think I mentioned this, but ad podding itself isn't necessarily a brand new concept to programmatic. It has been around. It's the standardization of that communication that's exciting about RTB. It's a protocol that lets everybody build to the same specification. But I think the other thing that when we talk about it, I mentioned this before, it's really about creating kind of a consistency between linear and CTV, where you have a TV-like viewing experience. And that is part of what we love and why we're so excited about FAST, because it is that consistent experience from a linear environment to a CTV and streaming environment. So that's a huge part of it. It also allows multiple ad requests to be sent and stitched together rather than sending an individual slot. So, that was a challenge because it created latency. You didn't know that you were buying into a pod. And you also didn't know how that affected whether you were buying slot 1 or slot 4. So, when you think about the benefits to this, obviously we're talking about optimizing metrics like, CPM per second, which is relatively new. And just so that we're clear on what that means, when you look at the duration of a pod itself, it could be a 2-minute pod. You could have multiple slots within that pod. And, in prior iterations, you just look for the highest bid and say, okay, whatever the highest bid is, I'm going to let that win that slot. But rather than just looking at the highest bid, the better bet is to look at it as the highest bid based on the amount of seconds of the duration of the creative. And what that lets you do is think about your ad pod as not just individual slots, but in its totality. right? So how much money can I make, or how do I maximize the value of each second of my ad pod? And moving to this podded structure really lets us do that. I think second, I mentioned this, reduction in latency in CTV auctions. And what I'm talking about there is, prior to, when you were sending individual requests for each slot, it took time for the buyer to understand, to look at each slot, respond to each slot. It was costly. It's relatively ineffective. Sending the information as a pod. So, hey, this is a pod that has 4 slots in it, letting the buyer understand that, and then sending back creative across all of those is the best way to ensure sort of maximum efficiency, minimize latency, and give everybody the best chance to actually deliver the pod, which is the number one. Really, we have to be able to deliver on that functionality. I think the other thing that I'm really excited about is, this concept of slot-based targeting. And what that means is, if you think about how linear has behaved historically, the first and last, commercials going into the break and coming out of the break have always had a higher value from a sell side perspective. And it makes sense. Your share, the likelihood that the viewer is attenuating to that communication at that period of time is just much higher. And so, publishers on that side, on the linear side, have always charged more, and it's made sense. It's been impossible to do until this concept of pods, because you just didn't know where that slot was within the pod, or you didn't even know that it was a pod. So now that we've brought around this concept of podded buying, now you can designate slot 1 and slot 4 as your beginning and your end, and charge more for those slots. And that's really valuable both for the buy side. They love buying those slots because they know that there's a higher level of attention. And from the sell side, you should be realizing higher CPMs on that. So that's a really exciting evolution for both sides of the conversation. And then I think last but not least, the concept of podding lets you uphold what we've always sort of held in terms of competitive separation from a brand perspective. If you didn't know that you were buying into a pod, or if we weren't handling things at the pod level, there's no way to know that 2 brands that shouldn't air next to each other are about to do that. If everything is handled at a slot level, you don't have that visibility. And so creating the concept of a pod lets us understand, hey, these 2 brands should never air next to each other, and lets the publisher designate that for us. So we adhere to those guidelines and those rules. And that's a really, really key evolution to driving more adoption on the CTV side. Brands have always been a little bit concerned about our ability to do that. And again, this ties to transparency. I don't know if I'm getting this level of competitive separation. Well, now with podded communication, we can guarantee that. We can stand behind that and know that we're not going to deal with that. The other thing that we think about a lot here at Beachfront is, how a frequency of exposure, across a pod. How many times is the same brand airing within one pod? We can set controls around that. Again, it requires a podded understanding to be able to do that. The last thing I actually did want to highlight that isn't necessarily part of the bullets, but in terms of how we're handling, or how we will be handling pod structure moving forward with this new specification, there's 3 different types. There's the structured ad pod, which is you as a publisher can go in and define each slot and the duration of each slot. So you can say this is slot 1, slot 2, slot 3, slot 4. Each one of them is 30 seconds. And that's been available, but I think is important, again, for being able to designate A and Z positions. The other thing that we are able to do is dynamic ad pods, where it's really, you leave it up to us. You tell us you want to optimize to a specific metric, or you will tell the industry that you want to optimize to a specific metric, and let that partner fill the inventory, or fill the pod itself with the maximum value of duration or creative that we can, based on your creative duration or your pod duration. And then the third thing is a hybrid ad pod. And this is something that I'm really, really jazzed about, because it lets you do a bit of both. So again, we talked about A and Z position. You can set the A and Z position within a pod, and then in the middle sort of say, hey, we want these 2 things to be more valuable, but then we'll let you sort of determine what the best value is for everything in the middle. You fill it with as much high quality as you can, based on what that monetization looks like. So all of these things are really, really exciting, and it's not about choosing one or the other. And that'll be a little bit of a theme for today, but it's really about figuring out how best to leverage all of them, right? And the key here is, now on the other end of it, the buyer will understand that this is how you're structuring things, and will be able to respond accordingly. So really excited about that piece. The other thing that obviously wanted to talk about is around content metadata. And I think, again, really what that comes down to is transparency of where you're actually advertising as a buyer, and creating that information for the buyer as a publisher, right? So right now there's about 30 fields in what we call a content object. And you can kind of see what that looks like on the right side of the screen. But really all it is just a protocol, again, for passing the information about the show itself, right? And that includes information like genre, ratings, the series itself, and now with the new version of 2.6, network and channel. So it's just adding to the plethora of things that we can and should be communicating to the buy side as best we can from a publisher perspective. I think the value here and where we see this as an opportunity is really to continue to drive premium pricing in the programmatic atmosphere or ecosystem with higher CPMs by providing richer content signals. So I don't want you to think about providing that transparency as contrary to direct sold. It's actually something that you can do in accordance with, right? And the way that we do that, or the way that we work with our publisher partners to do that, is to create that transparency and then set price floors, right? So I will not accept a bid lower than this because this is valuable inventory. And using that as a toggle or as a vehicle to control the value of your inventory while still creating that transparency is the best way to drive adoption and to have people bid into that inventory. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. It also lets us elevate what is connected in TV as inventory, that concept of the lower quality. This is the best way for us to elevate the perception of that quality in the space. When people see what's there and what's in there, it's just sort of surprising. Like, this is great content. These are things that are valuable for brands to be aligned with, and people will pay accordingly, especially if you're leveraging that price floor. And I think, lastly, providing that media buying client with transparency, all of that goes into confidence and creating buyer confidence. So, the content object itself is not new. The addition of network and channel, which are really key signals, is something that we're excited about because, again, it's just more visibility for the buy side. And we always encourage, and I'll talk more about this, our publisher partners to leverage price floors to be able to maximize the value of that. So you can still have your cake and eat it too, so to speak. And then I think, the other thing that we talk a lot about, especially when you're talking about the content object signals, is the normalization of that information. So what I mean by that is, yes, it's standardized, but we see different values pass through for different things. And so standardizing that and making it consistent for buyers is really, really key. They need to know what each of those signals means, and they need to know what to expect out of each of those signals. From our perspective, we've seen, substantial lifts in CPM for the same inventory that has those standardized signals versus when it doesn't. So that's that 30% lift is, the same content, the same partner when they include those signals versus when they don't include those signals. And so we see a substantial lift. It's not that the inventory itself has changed. It's just what is made available to the buyer. So again, it isn't a theoretical thing, it's a practical thing. We do see increases or improvement in what we're able to drive in terms of monetization. So normalizing those signals, making them as consistent as possible, making them understandable for the buy side is key. And then you will see corresponding lifts, especially, like I said, when you're leveraging price floors for those pieces. And this is really kind of I really love this concept, and I think this really underscores the value of the different ways that you can start to monetize inventory as a publisher, right? And I think when we talk about this, we talk about the movement across this continuum from control to efficiency. So if you think about the left side of that direct sold concept, this is the sort of the legacy model. One buyer, one seller, we're transacting directly. Programmatic guaranteed is a way to do that with some workflow automation built into it. So it simplifies that buying process, but it does enable both the brand and the seller and the publisher to have maximum control of who's running on it and what they're buying. And there is a huge role for this in the ecosystem. So not to belittle that, but as you move to the right, you see a little bit less of the direct sold control and a little less of the efficiency, but you also generate a lot more value in some of the other pieces in private marketplace. So you still have one seller, but you have multiple buyers now. So you're in a auction model, but you're doing more for price flooring, right? So in this universe, it's really around making sure that it's a limited number of people that can participate in that auction. They've agreed to that price floor. They get access to that auction based on some direct communications, but you're allowing it to transact in a programmatic atmosphere. And then all the way to the right, where you have open exchange, right, or auction based, which is multiple sellers, multiple buyers, And the pricing is often dictated by what the bid density is. You can still leverage things like price floors in that conversation, but there is more. It's going to be more dictated by what people are willing to pay. I think one thing I want to make crystal clear is that to be effective, it is not about choosing one of these strategies. It's about how you balance all of these strategies, right? Because every one of them has its role in your monetization pathway. Every one of them can be valuable. And there are tools available to our publisher partners to be able to leverage each one of these things, still uphold the value of their inventory, and drive and stimulate bid demand or buying demand from the buy side. So it's really about figuring out the right balance of those things. And it's different for each person. There's no one size fits all. Everybody's going to be in slightly different spots for this. But these things now being available across the board is what makes us excited, and where we do see opportunities for continued growth in FAST and AVOD. These are, we haven't fully realized this mix yet, and we will over time. Other industry trends, I think we at Beachfront are really excited about the rise of retail media, but it's not just us. I think everybody's pretty excited about the rise of retail media. We see it as a hugely growing industry. The reason why we get excited about this is because, as you think about retail media, you think about enhanced addressability, enhanced accountability. And we talked about that ability to sort of look and understand and assess the value of this inventory from a brand perspective. Retail media has a really great lens on that because they understand where it's running, and then they can understand the value from what people buy in a very practical sense, right? So when we talk about performance media, retail media is a great player in that space. I think creative innovations, and we'll continue to see this. I think a lot of what we're seeing is just the early days of this conversation. People are leveraging the connectivity of, FAST channel and AVOD and CTV in general, but we're only just beginning. I think what's really key when we talk about creative innovation, we think about the value of creative in this space is about finding that balance where you can engage customers or consumers with interesting communication without overstepping or creating a disruptive experience. But we are just starting to get into that conversation as an industry. And then last but not least is evolving changes in identity. And again, I mentioned this only because the great challenge of our time is going to be understanding what users are living in each of these individual ecosystems and understanding the totality of our impact as we work across those things. And when we talk about convergence, much of what sits under that convergent conversation is around identification, not individual identification, but resolution so we can control for user experience, resolution so we can understand efficacy of the media itself. And a lot of those things are going to come from changes in identity, where we are excited about that piece, especially is where we can do that in a privacy compliant way. And CTV represents a great opportunity to do that, but we still have a lot of work to do in terms of understanding how these pieces communicate with each other. So these are just some of the industry trends that we always highlight because I think it really represents great opportunities for AVOD and FAST, CTV in general. But these are areas where we're focused on from a monetization perspective and growing these things. So, last, I wanted to finish off with some best practices for CTV ad monetization. I think we've covered a number of different topics about things that we're seeing, trends, growth of the space. Obviously, we've talked quite a bit about RTV 2.6 adoption and what that means for creating visibility and transparency and the quality of the inventory and where brands are buying into. And that's obviously part of the best practices, but we wanted to spend a little bit of time just giving you some of the recommendations we're making to our publisher partners out of our playbook. So I think it starts with the content metadata. And I think the reason it starts with that for us is really has a lot to do with the fact that it is about creating that transparency. It is about creating trust, getting that trust from brands that they're running an inventory that they want their brand to be associated with. But I think it also allows us to unlock, a higher CPM. And I mentioned this because we talked about that continuum, especially when you deal with private marketplaces. The more visibility you're doing, the more you can adjust that bid floor where you're getting the most out of that inventory that you can. But even on the open auction, same concept. You're still driving more and you're stimulating more bid density through this information. So provisioning content metadata we see as an absolute key. Most, if not, many of our partners are doing that, different extents, but that continues to grow, right? Even on the lower end of that conversation continues to grow. The movement to ad pods. And I think for us, this is as much about user expectation as it is about creating positive experiences. for the publisher and for the user. When we understand things as an ad pod, and the buy side understands things as an ad pod, we can control things like competitive separation, frequency, all those things, all that stuff that we just talked about is really key. But we also get to understand things from a CPM per second perspective, right? Rather than thinking of things as an individual slot, how do I maximize what's happening in my pod? Third thing, taking a flexible sales approach to deals and sales channels. I mentioned this earlier in our conversation around that continuum. It is not about one. It is about how to leverage all three of those pieces to be the most efficacious you can in your monetization. So when we talk to our partners, it isn't about just going programmatic guaranteed. It isn't just about being open exchange or just PMP. It's figuring out how to leverage each of those tools in a way that lets you maximize the most amount that you can within each of those things, preserve the integrity of your content, and also open up opportunities for people to buy in each of those channels where brands are excited to lean in. And then last but not least, and we've made this a huge part of this conversation, but really keeping a close eye on viewer experience. One of the things that we talk a lot about at Beachfront, and I think this is universal across the industry, is that while we can get people into our content, what really matters is that they stay through that content, both from the content itself and then staying through the ad pod. So even if somebody's engaged with content, if they start the ad pod but don't finish the ad pod, you don't, as a publisher, you're not able to monetize that. You're not able to make that revenue. And so a huge part of that is keeping consistency in the user experience itself. If you look at what's been going on with linear for decades, we as TV viewers have a certain expectation of quality, both quality of the actual video itself, quality of the stream, quality of consistency of how often you're seeing a brand. And so where we need to continue to grow as an industry is in preserving that and expanding on that, right? And I think if we're able to do that, not only are you going to see users continue to stay engaged and leaned in and have a higher propensity to want to purchase brands or engage with brands, but you'll also see much better, completion on the content that they've started. So, it is incumbent upon all of us, to continue to look at how we're having impacts on viewer experience. I would be remiss if I did not at least mention in this conversation where we sit as Beachfront across the ecosystem. I've obviously mentioned a bit of what we do, and I know everybody has different partners, but specifically where we sit is sort of in between publishers and distributors and the buy side and media buyers. So we're really trying to be that layer of facilitation, helping with ad serving, unified decisioning for buyer prioritization, and then creating a marketplace where people can connect and engage and purchase content or purchase advertising within specific content. We have been doing this for a number of years, but obviously our focus really is on the convergence, convergent component of this conversation. We see it as a key to the evolution of this industry. And so, we're able to help, both our buy side partners and our publisher side partners with making this a more consistent user flow or user experience to purchase this content. Our platform, I think if we really kind of boil it into three things, it's around, maximizing revenue, creating that operational efficiency, and then really we are hugely focused on premium viewer ad experiences. Again, that is the underpinning to all of this. If we're not able to do that, then we're not going to retain those eyeballs, or platforms are going to lose users. So it is really key to us. But that's us in a nutshell. And I guess with that, I'll turn it over to any questions. If I know we've moved through this, but happy to answer any questions that anybody has in this space or just in general.
Thanks, Amit. That was really well laid out education for many of us, I'm sure. And yeah, I'm sure there must be a bunch of questions. Covered a lot, actually, in a very short period of time. So thanks a lot. I do have some questions. I want to dive into a few things while we wait for other folks to jump in. But going all the way back, you were talking about lack of transparency in where my ad is being played against which content, and that's something that is kind of specific to CTV, and to me that seems really surprising. I mean, it seems like that's something we should have data about, and I think we do somewhere, right? You know that how come that isn't getting reported, and is that a problem that technology or maybe standards can help solve?
Yeah, I think it isn't that it isn't always available. It's just that it's not uniformly universally available. What we're focused on is trying to make those signals available in every bid request. So everybody's kind of in a different space in that transparency or that continuum. What we see is, the more of that information you provide, the more likely it is that you're going to have stronger bid density. It isn't, but everybody's at different sort of phases of that. So it isn't that it doesn't exist. That has existed and does exist. It's just trying to get everybody to the same place on that and getting as much adoption as we can.
Yeah, I think you make a great point that as sure, it's important for individual companies, individual publishers to move forward, but it's also really important as an industry that we move forward to build trust in what we're doing in CTV and OTT for ad buyers to continue to trust that there's value for them here. And I do appreciate your bringing up standards. It's something that we're really interested in helping support at OTT.X. So we have a few questions here. Here's one from Michael Santana. How are you thinking about the frequency or frequency capping across devices?
Yeah, I think that's a key question, right? So understanding not just the individual device, but understanding things at a household level. So a lot of the conversations that we have, and I think everybody industry-wise is in a slightly different spot from a device graphing perspective, or either in a different spot or has a different partner. What we try and do is really understand what that looks like for each partner and do the best that we can to try and mitigate those things across devices. I don't think there's any one perfect answer for this, but I think, to that point, the more we can think about things as users or households rather than individual devices, the more likely it is that we're keeping those positive experiences. So that really ties to that very, very closely. So a lot of what we're doing is working with our publisher partners to understand what that looks like for them, and then trying to preserve that in terms of what they're setting in our platform and around frequency capping.
Mm-hmm. This is something I'm wondering about as well. A question here from Arnaud and Kav. I'm sorry, I didn't get your name pronounced correctly, but from AWS. Thanks for joining us. How do you see audience buying as a growing trend versus programmatic buying? And are you building integrations to solve for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it's really, really key. We see both, and I think so. I just want to make sure I'm answering the question accurately. When we're saying audience buying versus programmatic buying, I think if it's talking about buying in terms of like reach frequency or larger audiences versus, like a GRP sort of metric versus individual addressable on the programmatic side, I think part of that is literally in the convergence, right? So if you think about where everybody is in terms of the ability to target audiences, not everybody's in the same place from a linear perspective all the way to like the most programmatic. The other thing that sits underneath this whole conversation is what's going to happen and how we're going to continue to evolve in terms of the addressable signals we're able to use, both personally identifiable information, what's going to happen with the cookie in the desktop universe. So we always kind of say this: don't let perfect be the enemy of good. When we talk to brands, and especially when we talk to brands about linear inventory, that's really, really strong inventory. Brands are always looking for positive, brand safe environments to run in, and they're looking for easier ways to transact on that. Even if not every signal that's coming through is perfectly addressable, it doesn't change that the users are real. It doesn't change that the content is great. So I think where we sit on it is sort of, we are trying to enable all of it. We have a number of like unique identifiers that we're pushing into the bid stream, but we also, are looking with some of our linear partners around more audience-based buying or content-based buying as well. So it's a little bit of everything. If I'm getting that question right, if I'm not, any clarification would be great. I just want to make sure I'm answering the question.
Yeah, go ahead and post a follow-up question if we didn't really hit that one, but great answer anyway. Yeah. We have a couple of questions here on the best practices that you went through. I don't know if you want to pull that slide up again, or not. But in the context of FAST, are four of these best practices more directed at channel publishers or at platforms?
Sorry, say that one more time, Eric. I apologize.
Yeah. In the context of FAST, are these best practices more directed at channel partners or platforms? They apply more to channels and platforms.
Yeah, I think so. I would say that it has probably more to do with the channel partners in terms of how do we create those. I mean, the goal of the platform, if I'm understanding, is really to enable these, these best practices, but it really has more to do with how we execute or how we focus on them as an industry. And a lot of that has to do with our channel partners. So it is a bit of both, but I think I would, if I'm answering that, I'd say it's probably more on the channel partnership side.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question for ad buyers. Do you feel, are you really seeing maybe a somewhat of a hesitancy to jump in more than they are in CTV because some of the limitations of experience, or some of the by experience I mean user experience, where we aren't always able to really guarantee you're not going to see the same ad over and over, or that overexposure that you're mentioning, or maybe the quality won't be there, the consistency won't be there. Is that real?
I think it is. I think it is, and I think part of the growth in CTV in terms of budget allocation has to do with the eyeballs, but it also has to do with our ability to grow on some of those pieces as an industry. And I think we've taken huge steps forward. So it isn't to say that we are at the starting line and we have to go all this distance. We've taken great steps forward on a number of these things. Again, content metadata is not a new concept, right? RTB 2.6 is just an expansion of that. So I think a lot of what you see in the growth of that is an understanding of what some of those pieces are. But I do think that it has been, and I think the proof will really be as we see potted expansion grow. We're really early days in this. As I mentioned, it was April 2022, which seems like a little ways ago, but to get to an adoption level across the industry where everybody's using it's going to take some time. I think the proof will really be there too. If we see continued growth or incremental growth from the inclusion of potted communication, you'll realize that brands have been kind of holding back a little bit because they just can't trust it. And I know, coming from the brand side, brand integrity and content alignment is hugely important. So, you're always having that conversation with brands. How much can you trust what's there? How much can you trust the signals? And so that's a big part of it. I do think it's huge.
Yeah, it's always been something that we've touted as being a real value of dynamic ads in the streaming and OTT environment. And, still we're challenged to deliver on it. And I wonder how much of that has to do, the technology is there. I wonder how much that has to do with just not receiving the metadata about content, or it's just not being used by the ad platforms. Or maybe there's just like, hey, there's just nothing else sold, so we can put nothing here, I guess, or we can like throw your ad up again.
Yeah. I think it's a little bit on everybody here, right? I just to not obviously not a finger pointing exercise, but I think it's partially what signals were being sent, and the consistency of those signals, and again, normalization of those signals, because for a buyer to understand that, especially programmatically, it needs to be consistent. Otherwise, it's not going to resolve in the bidder. So I think that's a part of it. So how consistently is it being sent? How consistently is it being sent the same way? That's a big part of it. And I think we've taken steps there. I think the other part of it is, how calibrated have buyers been, or how much importance have they put on that prior to until relatively recently. And I think that's growing. But we as an industry, especially at the beginning of the advent of programmatic, we way over-indexed on audience, right? I mean, we saw that as this is the best way for us to target the person that we know is the most relevant for this ad. And context kind of fell by the wayside a little bit there. And I think, if you think about this pendulum, we went from pure context, everything about content mattered, to just the user mattered, to right where we probably need to be, which is that both of them matter. Understanding your user or understanding who that person is, and understanding where that content is running is key, right? Like, it can't be one or the other, especially when you're thinking about things in terms of brand integrity or performance, right? You need to be as a user, you need to be in a certain mindset to be able to receive that. So I think it's both. I really do. I think both groups have taken a big step forward in that, but there's still a ways to go. I think we can still continue to improve on it. And I think, like I said, that last mile is really a lot of what's been going on in linear. So it's kind of interesting to see some of that stuff starting to replicate here.
Yeah, if it's not broke, that there's a lot of good things about the linear. Are there things that we can do as an industry, do you think, to really demonstrate, I guess, to the ad buying community, and that we're there, and that this is maybe even a standard around fast, right? So we can sort of the stamp of approval, right, that says this is guaranteed to give you these qualities when you buy it.
Yeah, I think, not to belabor this, I think a big part of it is 2.6 adoption. I think there's other things we can do. So I'll start with that, but I think 2.6 is that movement into, like I said, that potted structure. And I think if we get adoption on the publisher side, on the buy side, and we're getting really strong signals on both sides that this matters. So I'm really confident that we're going to get there with this piece. This seems like an iteration and evolution that both buy side and pub side want. It benefits both. And I think once we get that and we normalize that piece, that's a huge step, right? Because now we're all talking the same language. Now we understand where it sits in a pod. Now we understand that it sits in a pod. Let's just start with that. That's hugely valuable. So I think that's a big piece. I think the other part of it will have to do with previous question, right? That reach, frequency, understanding. And I think we're not there yet. Even if you think about it, even if you extrapolate it past just the pod, we're just taking the step where we're understanding that it's a pod is a huge step. How about the understanding that it's a whole program? And now you've got multiple pods within one program, right? And you've got one user who's watched through that entire experience, has seen all of those pods. What does the reach frequency look like at that level, right? What does the competitive separation look like at that level? And it's not that, even that, and even on some of the linear stuff, that's not always universally true within a single piece of content. But I think we can take steps there. And I think we might even be able to iterate past that point and really create a lot of value. So I think that's something that could be on the horizon. I don't know exactly when, but we went from understanding it was just a slot, just an ad opportunity, to now we're understanding that it's a pod, to eventually understanding that it's a program. And that's the progression I think we need to think about. That's how users think about things. We don't think about it as, oh, here's the first ad pod. We think about it as watching a show.
Well,
so that's
I'm sure you do.
Yeah, I do, but I can tell you my wife doesn't. So
right, exactly. Yeah, I wonder if there's ever a time when, and maybe there will be, where we're actually buying, or there's actually metadata about this specific content prior to a pod, right? So you've got the first 10 minutes of a television episode has this metadata, and then the second section has this metadata, and they may have different demand depending on who the buyer, who the brand might be. Is that available within the spec?
Yeah, I think it's not available today, or it would be difficult to incorporate that. But I think one thing that I've seen the IAB do consistently, and that's what makes me really excited about this, is that they are starting to move in that direction. They're starting to think about things and standardize things at that direction, right? The recent announcement of, the introduction of the watermarking technology. That's a huge evolution, especially as we think about things in convergence, because that's a universal piece, right? So we start to understand users at a universal level. I think, as we start to get more into diagnosis of like what is in the content, and we're doing that, right? I think just understanding the content object metadata is a huge step. It's a first step. But we could go past that point in terms of, I don't know, maybe eventually tonality. These are things that are, very future looking. But I think these are all things that we can start to do and we can pass, and it can have an impact on, the progression of what you're willing to pay throughout a piece of content, right? So, these are all things that could be in the horizon. But I think it takes a group like the IAB to standardize a lot of that stuff, right? If everybody's inventing sort of their own individual standards for this stuff, you get right back to the same challenge where buyers, you don't have uniformity across that, right? And so the buyers don't know how to buy across that. So for us as an industry to take that step forward, it's got to be relatively uniform. Yeah, there's a real important education. I mean, this stuff is changing so fast. There's so much going on. There's so many new opportunities, new technologies. I think many of those that are, maybe just getting started or have gotten started are, swimming in really deep water right now and have, or drinking from the fire hose maybe. And then, it just got bigger. Now we've got this 2.6 thing and, trying to keep up with it. I think it's a big challenge. And it's probably never going to stop, right? Don't plan on it. Okay, well, after we get this figured out, it's not going to settle down. So if you're getting into this space, you need to plan for that. You need to have scale kind of built into your own organization in terms of its ability to take in more complexity and to continue to grow. You're not building something that's going to be around for 5 years or maybe even a year. Yep. Yeah, I agree with that. That's where I think reaching out and relying on not trying to do it yourself. Maybe if you're Amazon, you can, but not everybody's Amazon. You don't have a fleet of engineers all over the place. And so I would say, really do reach out to folks like Beachfront and all of
the service providers, there's many of them that are OTT.X members. We'd love to get you in touch with folks that can help you, because that's their job, is keeping up on this stuff and having the technologies and the people to actually deliver on that. See where we're at time. We have a little more time. Are you okay on time, Amit?
Yep, I'm great.
Okay, great. So here's a question again from our friend Michael Santana. Is there an equal push from the demand side on DSPs to provide metadata about content back to publishers, looking at it from the other side?
That's a great, in terms of what result, why they were willing to pay as much. It's a really interesting point. I'd say no, not yet. I think, we're trying to create as much visibility as we can as that middle layer for our publishers about what's driving the best outcomes for them in terms of bid density and, revenue realization. Is there an opportunity to provide more? For sure. I think it's got to be middle layers like us. I think the system's not built for the demand side to necessarily send information back without somebody like a beachfront in the middle of that. But I do think, the proof is sort of in the pudding with that stuff, right? Like what they do and how they spend and how much they're willing to spend is sort of the best way that they can indicate that this is good or this is bad, where they're throttling off QPS or throttling on QPS. So I think, there are conversations. I think, could we make it stronger? Absolutely. I think the more validation that the buy side has, that the things that they're doing is exactly the sell side has, that they're doing what the buy side wants, the more likely it is that we're going to get that adoption. I think, a lot of times, and it makes perfect sense, it's cart and horse conversation. Is a pub side adoption, and then you get the demand side adoption? Does the demand side have a huge appetite for something, and then the pub side adopts it? And it's always a little bit of both. But I do think, especially as we start to see things like 2.6, publisher partners are constantly asking, like, how much appetite is there on the buy side for this type of stuff? And we know, there are partners of ours that are asking on the buy side for this, want to test into this. So that's stimulating some of that. And I think, like I said, the more signals we can send, the better, right? That's gonna motivate us into the right positions as an industry.
Yeah, and I think there is room for that, as maybe as a trade association, as OTT.X, to maybe build up some demonstrable data, right, to report out. Folks that are using these standards are seeing better results in terms of reach, these are growth measures in terms of adoption of these new protocols or new methodologies or new functions, to help everybody keep up with what's really going, what is going on. This is an ever-changing world. I wonder if we'll ever see a time also when, I was thinking about when you're talking about adjacency, you're also, if you have an ad, you're adjacent to another ad.
Yep.
Right, potentially. And so if there's an ad that's really doing well, you got to see, the ad with the puppies from the Super Bowl. It's hilarious. Then being right after that ad can be more valuable than being after some other ad. And I'm sure someone's thought of this, but I don't know if there's dynamic ad ratings. But that could also be something that could really support continued adoption of CTV.
Absolutely. I don't think it's being done right now. But I think that there's, again, we just got to the understanding, especially in OTT CTV, that it is a pod, right? So what is it, next to it's to another ad. I think, if from a brand hat perspective, they're always looking to figure out the best way to improve, whatever their performance metric might be, right? Brand favorability, obviously, at the end of the day, it's about purchase. And so a lot of these things, you look at these things together, and I think we have, interestingly, maybe the ability as an industry, especially on the CTV side, to maybe provide additional data points around that maybe are harder to provide, in different environments. So, I think it all kind of ties into, what is the information that we're passing and providing? And then how can people sort of correlate that to efficacy? And I think that's going to be an ever evolving conversation for us, right? And we talked about, pod level, program level. I mean, we're going to be thinking about things that we maybe never thought about, right?
Yeah.
So it really does become kind of a fascinating conversation for brands. And this was the stuff that I was really steeped in early on in my career.
Yeah, it sure is. And for those that may not be seeing the returns that they're hoping for as publishers or channels in the ad space, you're in the right spot, I think. Anyway, yeah, it's we're not done yet. There's a lot more that's going to happen here, and you know, if I would just urge folks to, you know, stick with it and continue to let's work together to help drive the value of the CTV platforms and OTT together. I think we could talk about this for a lot longer. We have more questions, but maybe you can come back and hang out with a little more at some point, Amit, and we'd love to see you at some of our upcoming events, things like that. But we're gonna close things up for today. With that, thanks again, Amit, for a fantastic presentation and valuable information, insights, and made us all think a little bit, I think, too. Thanks also to Beachfront for your support of OTT.X, and thanks to all of you for attending the webinar today. As always, the session was recorded. It's going to be available on the OTT.X website very shortly. There's a lot of other presentations and videos from our past webinars and past events, so go check those out. Also, want to take a minute to remind everyone to check out our 2023 calendar events and activities. Jose is going to paste that out, our link to that schedule out on the chat right now. So you can check that out for reference. Just a couple of things. On April 4th, we're going to be in New York for another invigorating edition of our popular roundtable discussions sessions. If you haven't registered, do so soon if you're interested. Space is limited for the event, so you might want to think about that soon. At NAB in April, you can join us for our Fulfilling OTT.X NAB breakfast event. Of course, one of our flagship events, the X Fronts, is being held at the Skirball Center in LA on May 23rd and 24th. So don't miss out on the Fast Forefronts, where prominent and upcoming AVOD and FAST platforms, networks, and channels provide details about their lineups, promotions, viewer demos, and plans for the year, and advertising opportunities to streaming buyers. I also want to invite folks to get involved with the OTT.X community, including you, Amit. We'd love to have you involved in some of our interest groups. There's some for ad video, among a number of other things. Interest groups are groups of OTT.X members that meet periodically to share learnings, develop solutions for common issues in OTT distribution. We have interest groups for ad-supported video, tech and service providers, diversity, and women in OTT, among others. You can find out more and sign up for common interest groups at the link that I'm going to drop in also into the chat in just a minute. So that concludes our webinar today. Thanks everybody for being a part of the fun. It was great having you here. And Amit, once again, thanks a lot. I hope to see you soon.
Thanks so much, guys. Thank you, Eric. And yes, absolutely. Would love to come back, and looking forward to, you know, all the events. So thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thanks everybody. Have a great day.